Hey guys, so this is the second part of this series where we're exploring using HTML, JavaScript, CSS to basically set up some simple web games. It's web development within the context of gaming, but these are pretty simple games. So it's basically a Tic Tac Toe game. It's 5x5 grid, and it just counts the number of three in a row, and four in a row wins. And I did it with HTML and JavaScript. But then in the second part, I really want to demonstrate how I set this up with Firebase. So I'm saving all the information to the real-time database in Firebase, and I'm hosting it on Firebase. So getting both of those things working for the first time. So it was an interesting journey. And let me first demo the game. And I'll demo it by sharing the screen here. And so right there. So what I'm going to do is, let me get rid of that. There we go. What I'm going to do is, you've got two players, so I have to simulate like two devices. So this little screen you see here, that I just opened, so this is going to be the first player coming in. And that's just the URL for that Firebase gives you for the app. And so I go there. There we go. And so that's what the first player sees. And the first player is always red, and he's always got to wait for the second player to join. And you can see if you click on a square there, you don't really get anything because he's not allowed to do anything till the second player joins. Now the second player, in order to make that happen, I'm going to use an incognito window, because when you do that, what happens is Firebase, for some reason, will believe that's an actual second device. So would you imagine, if you want to imagine that's a second device, same URL, exactly the same URL, and there's the second player. And the second player comes in saying, oh, it's your opponent's turn. So he can't, if you click on a square, he can't do anything. But now the first player takes his turn, and now you see that the information is shared. It appears in the second player's screen as well. That's using the Firebase database to do that. Now it's the second player's turn. Back to red, green. So, and if it's whoever's turn it is, the other person is not allowed to do anything. They're just kind of in wait mode. And now we go back to red. He got three in a row, so he gets a score. And that's reflected again on both screens. And then, oh, green got three in a row. Now he gets one. Green has two that are three in a row. And then finally, red gets four in a row, and that's a win, and that's it. Game is over. Can't do anything. Let me show you what it looks like in the database. And this is the database. And so the database, initially it's got two kind of parent nodes. That's the structure of this database. It's not like SQL at all. It's like a big tree, or a series of trees with, parents and children and grandchildren and so forth. And so you can think of it as a tree. So there's two parents here, game stats and players. Game stats has the current status of the game. It's a 5x5 array, and it's 0 if it's white. The score is white, 1 if it's red, 2 if it's green, and it keeps track of whose turn it is. And then players has the players, and in this game in particular, there's only two players, and red and green, player number 1 and 2. And these IDs are just unique IDs, and they're really, I didn't produce them. It's called anonymous authentication. It's a Firebase feature which you can turn on, and users are signed in anonymously, so they don't see anything. They're in the background, they're assigned these IDs, and then you can use that programmatically to keep track of one from another. It doesn't really track much information about them, but again, it's very useful. And if I had been hosting this on a just a private server or something, I wouldn't be able to do this. So there's a lot of features associated with Firebase. So although it's a pain in the butt to get it going initially, in the long run, there are a lot of features that you can use, especially if you're doing game development, that will speed up the process. So that's that. And now let me go back here, and what I'll do is I'll exit the game. So both players will exit. And so we close the windows, and you can see that the database, it deleted those players. And now I'm going to delete this game state because I don't need it. And that's really the first part. Now the second part, I'm going to show you just a description of how I set this up. And it's in a Word document called Firebase Basics, and I put it up on the GitHub repo. I'll just go through it briefly. You can't go through all the details because you just wouldn't, most people would just lose interest. So let me share that. And it's window, and it's that one. And there it is. So first, just setting up Firebase. So setting up an account and a project, enabling the database so you can read these through and follow them. You get the configuration, which is just a lot of lines that Firebase uses internally, and you copy and paste that into your code. It'll look like this: Firebase config, that variable. And you have this information to set up Firebase in your JavaScript code, although you want to use the latest version of Firebase, which is at 9.12. I think it's 9.22. I'm going to change that in the document. And then these are methods you can use to save stuff to Firebase and retrieve data from Firebase. And I'll show you a couple of instances of that in the program. Like this is an example, like they're all, there's a reference which has to do with the path to the parent node that you're interested in the Firebase, in the database. And either on, and there are many variants of this, but it's an asynchronous function, and it only gets turned on when that parent or any of the children nodes get changed. When it gets changed, it automatically kind of wakes up the program, and that change will be reflected in this snapshot. And then snapshot, that .val is the way you retrieve. So you would retrieve the most recent data. And usually in a lot of these programs, that's really what kicks off some action in the program. You're just waiting for Firebase to tell you that something has happened. And so that's getting the database set up and having an account, but actually installing it on Firebase. So you could just get the database part working and put your files somewhere else. You might have your own server that you might host them on. That's perfectly legit, and I haven't done that myself, but presumably that would work. But I chose for various reasons to actually host it on Firebase. So these are the steps. It's a bit of a pain because it's like command line. You have to have Node.js and npm installed, and there would never be time to go through all the nuances of that. You'd have to look for a different video, but Node.js is very useful if you're doing web development, so it'd probably be a good idea to get that installed anyway. And if you have that installed with the recent versions, I would try to keep the most recent versions of everything, really. That way they'll sync together. And then Firebase command line interface. You would run this npm, stands for Node Package Manager. It's used to install things in Node. You can run that, and then the next two steps you want to go to wherever on your desktop or your machine you have your HTML and your CSS. Just you keep that all in a folder. You want to navigate to that and then run the next two steps: init hosting and then deploy. And the thing about this is, what I discovered is, every time you make a change, if you want to have it reflected on Firebase, you have to rerun Firebase deploy. You don't always need this only hosting, because if you have a database, it's not really only hosting. But you want to run that, and that's the thing that's a bit of a pain. And what some people do is they do most of the development somewhere else, and then at the end they move it all to Firebase. So you also, if you want to be able to see the most recent version, because it's coming from Firebase, there's something weird about the way it caches stuff. You just don't want to, you do not want to just bring it up. You have to clear data from the browser before you do that. And so let me show you. If not, you're not going to see the most recent version, because I think it's going to keep going from some kind of a web cache. I guess it's doing that to save processing speed or something. So I'm going to show you what I mean, because it took me a while before I figured this out. These little things are the kinds of things. So I'm going to share this particular screen. Yes, Chrome tab. So now let's suppose before I wanted to bring up most recent version of something in Firebase. This bar on the upper right hand side. By the way, more tools and developer tools is very good. Using that, if you're using Chrome, is a good way to debug your code and look at what's happening. But that would be a different discussion. You want it to clear your browsing information. Click on Clear Browsing Data. And on Chrome, you only want the first and the third ones. It's really this third one that is really what's doing it, but you don't want the second, because if you do that, it's going to sign you out. It's going to sign you out of all your sites, and that's just going to create another problem. So you'll be solving one problem and creating another. So you don't want to do that. So that's there are pluses and minuses to everything, and that's one of the negatives about this Firebase hosting. So now, and this document that I went through, it's up on the GitHub repo. It's called Firebase, I think Firebase Setup, something like that. It's the only Word doc currently up there. And now let me go in and I'm going to show you what the code looks like. And I don't want to bore you too much. I don't know how many people watching this are going to be into code, but I'm going to just do a brief rundown on it, because really, so just going to verify that you can see that. Yeah. So first, the HTML. And so there's not a lot to this HTML because, a lot of it's being done in JavaScript. So this is just keeping track of the player num, and the player call is player color. And then whose turn it is. So that's the ID, whose turn. So these are element IDs that I'll access in JavaScript. And that's the game board, which I populate dynamically through JavaScript. And then the scores. My score, other score, is the opponent's score. And then 1-4. If somebody gets 4 in a row, I'll populate that with a message. And that's it for the HTML. And where most of the work is going is in JavaScript. So, and there's one more thing maybe I should show you if I can see it. No, that's not there. All right. Okay. So this is just that header information that's coming from Firebase. And you notice I'm using 9.22.0. And this is where I'm getting, that's for the app. That's for the database. And the third thing is that anonymous authorization stuff. And what you see here, these are just the methods that I'm going to use. So any method you use, you got to put it up here and define it, or you're going to get an error message. It'll say it's not defined. And so you can save yourself some trouble there. And this is that config stuff that you'll get from the Firebase website. And then you just have to put this in, initializing the app and getting the database. And then, current turn is whose current turn it is. Number of players is the number of players I've detected. Items is just the internal version of the game board. My player number is what number I am. I'm either going to be 1 or 2. I had initially set this to 1, but that'll be reset by what I read from the database. And the only thing else I was going to warn you about is when you're doing these JavaScript, see if I can find where I'm doing it, where I'm bringing in main.js. You've got to make them modules. So that's the thing. Oh, it's up here, right? So that's just the header information for the HTML, which is kind of boilerplate. But the thing I had neglected to show you here is if you're bringing in the script information in HTML, you want to make the modules. And when you bring in the internal stuff, main.js, you have to make them modules as well. Because otherwise you'll get some kind of error message saying they're not modules. At least that's what I got. Anyway, we go here now. If you look at, here's the first place where we actually, in the JavaScript code, access the database. And so we give it a ref. So a ref is basically the path you're looking through the database. And you're always using this get database command just to get it. And we're looking for that parent node of players. And it's on value, meaning if the value of that or anything below it changes, that kicks this off. This kind of wakes up, and that change will be in snapshot.val. And so that way we can gather whatever players are in there so we can see, did the second player arrive or not? That's basically what we want to do. And so here we're counting the number of players. And then we just display an error message in the whose turn field. This is the standard get element by ID. So we're just accessing these HTML elements by ID and changing them to whatever message we want to say. If we don't have the second one in, we tell them to wait. Otherwise, we start telling them we want to initially set up the turns. So we want to set this up so that player 1 will go first, player 2 will go second. Now this is another on value event, and this is now reading the game state, which is the board and whose turn it is. So if that changes, like if the other player hit a square, clicked on a square, that's going to change. And then this gets fired for both players. They both get the most recent version of that information, the turn and that 5x5 array. And so it's being put in game state. Now we want that to go into items. So to do that, we use this command JSON parse, because this game state, and you notice we're using game state and it's board. So that's the child node of board. And if you recall in the database, that's exactly what it was. But we have to parse it in order to display it as a JavaScript array. So we're going from JSON to the JavaScript array. And then later when we save it, we use the opposite command, which is JSON stringify, to go from the array back to the JavaScript to save it in the database. So that's one of the things you have to do when you learn these things, from Googling it or looking from what other people are doing. And then if you recall, in that parent node came state, the child node of turn had the actual turn. So that's going to go in current turn. And then we just use that information. If the current turn is my player numbers, whoever my player number is. If the current turn is my player number, we give that the appropriate message. If not, we say it's your opponent's turn. Reload the squares reloads those divs in the HTML because they've changed, and tally score keeps track of the scores because if a player's clicked on a score, the scores may have changed. And that's that. And this is that anonymous authentication I was talking about. And I use this pretty heavily, and I'm glad that I discovered this. So this captures, when a user actually comes in, they're signed in anonymously, and there's something called a UID, which is internal to Firebase, and I assign that to player ID. And then I'm just creating what this is, this reference to the database, and then the path players/player ID. What this is doing, this is basically when you go and you do the set. So I'm doing the set further on down here. Set writes information out to the database. So it actually creates that node at that point. So it's kind of initializing the node. And so this is only if the number of players is still less than 2. So it's initializing the node with the color and the player number. And then it's also initializing the game board. Then when the second player goes through, that one also gets written out. And this is just something that you just have to have, that you need to set up anonymous authentication. So you're just catching it if they signed in anonymously, and I guess this way we can get an error if it didn't work out. But that's what we're doing. And now down here, this is just the event listener. When the page is completely loaded, we go through each row and column, and we create those little squares. And so that's what these little divs are. And we had done this, gone over this previously in the previous video. They all get added as children to this game board. And then we add an event listener. When the user clicks on the square, that's going to actually handle square click will happen. And which we'll describe when we get further on down. But so this is reload the squares, which is called when we need to update, refresh the screen. And we go through the items array by row and column. If it's 0, make the square white. 1, make the square red. 2, make it green. And then handle square click is when a square is clicked on. We're only going to do something if the current turn is the player number, meaning if it's your turn, and if it's a status of playing. So quite often in these games, you've got some kind of a status that tells you where you're at in the game. This is a simple game, so we only have 3. Status only takes on 3 values. Waiting, when we're waiting for both players to get in. And when it's waiting, they're not allowed to click on a square. Playing, when we're actually playing the game. And done. So done would be, for instance, if we have a win state. And then there's no need for anybody to click on a square. And so this checks to see if the square is occupied, and so on. And if it's occupied, we return. We don't do anything. So we're just using classes for that. That's what this class list for this square element is. And you can add as many classes as you want. And that's something that ChatGPT actually suggested, so I kept that. The initial rendering of this that I tried to get from ChatGPT was just too involved, and it just wasn't working. And I don't know, it seemed like some of its knowledge of the Firebase database was a year out of date or something. I don't know. But anyway, now what we're going to do is we're going to get the row and the column from the square ID, which is the ID. When the event is triggered, this is the way we get the actual ID that's triggered and the element that's triggered. Otherwise, we're not going to know how are we going to know what row and column it is? So that's how we get the rows and the columns, because they're embedded in this ID. And so we take that current player number, put it into the items array, that row and column. Now, we want to write that out again to the database. So this is the place where we write it out. So we use JSON stringify to make that array into JSON. And we call that current board. We also want to write out the turn, because if you clicked on a square, now it's the other guy's turn. So if the turn was 1, we want to make it 2. If it was 2, we want to make it 1. And here is where we actually do the set, this simple little command. We'll write that out to the database using a reference of, and the reference is the database and the node or path you want to follow. And the parent path here is game stats. And then within that reference, we want to update the turn and the current and the board. And that's what we do. And then we tally up all the scores. And that's just code that keeps track of how many 3 in a rows we have and whether we had 4 in a rows. And that's what all this is doing. That's what tally score is doing. It's doing it for player 1 and player 2, and just keeping track of them. Occurrences 1 and 2 will be the number of 3 in a row, vertically, horizontally, or diagonally we get. And if we happen to be in 1, this is what we display. And if we happen to be player 2, that's what we display. If you think about it, we have to switch them. So, and then whether you get 4 in a row, that's this function called has 4 in a row. And that's just going to return a true or a false, depending on whether you got 4 in a row. And then we just divide this into cases depending on which player had 4 in a row and which player I currently am, 1 or 2. It's like you have to account for that, because you're only using one version of this JavaScript, and it has to work for both players. So that's where it can get complex with multiplayer games. And then this is just the functions that do that. I didn't write these. I just didn't want to type all this stuff. So I actually asked ChatGPT to do it. And if you ask it a specific enough question, it's very good at this sort of thing. So it went through and it counted the number of, occurrences of 3 in a row, in a 5x5 array that consists of 0, 1s, and 2s. So 3 in a row of, 1s. Here's just counting 1s in the items array. And so it did that, and then I had to do it for 2, and then I also had to do check to see. This is a function that returns a Boolean, true or false. Just depending, looking for, here it's looking for, 4 in a row. I guess these are rows, these are columns, and so forth. So that's it. And I realized that explanation was a little long-winded, but I guess this is we're supposed to be talking about coding here. So I did my best to explain the code. I'm probably not going to do that twice. So hopefully you benefited from it. I'm going to put this up on the GitHub repo, so you're welcome to use anything from it. And as well, I'd love to get suggestions for what the next step would be. I'm thinking of maybe adding a chat to the game, and I'm also thinking of investigating whether to, how easy would it be now that this is, using the Firebase database, how easy would this be to, make it into an Android app, for instance, or something like that. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. And, let me stop sharing this. There we go. So I hope you found this interesting and enjoyable, and have a nice day or evening or whatever the case may be. Bye.